And as my title indicates, my talk today will explore the field of teacher education through 3 categories: questions, stories, and truths. And I'll begin with a story. Last spring, SUNY Chancellor Nancy Zimpher, who's one of President Obama's, he has acknowledged that she's one of his favorite chancellors. And she's the chancellor of the SUNY system, the whole SUNY system. She visited our campus to take some question and answer from faculty and from students, some of whom were protesting because of some decisions that she had made or had been made by the trustees. So during the question and answer period, the person who handled placements for our fieldwork, student teachers and fieldwork, asked her a question. She said to Chancellor Zimpher, are you concerned at all, or what are you doing to support us as the Common Core standards make it more and more challenging for us to get placements because teachers are feeling more pressure? Right, this is a question she had. I thought it was a really good question. And Chancellor Zimpher basically made fun of the teachers who were expressing concern and said, what is wrong with teachers anyway? Why are they so upset about people coming to their classrooms? We have a medical school, SUNY Downstate Medical School, and it's a teaching college, and we do all that kind of thing all the time. What is wrong with teachers? So, I was in the audience, and that just made me really angry. I was upset that she treated our placement person like that. I thought it was a really dismissive way to treat her. And so, despite the fact that the president of our college and the provost and the dean of the School of Education were all in the front row, I raised my hand. And I pointed out that there were some differences between teaching hospitals and schools. For example, students in public education are compelled to attend schools. Most people go to a hospital voluntarily. Right? They choose their doctor, they decide they're going to go. I mean, nobody voluntarily gets ill, right? But you get my point. There's a difference. And furthermore, doctors are not expected to implement unproven, untested practices, which is what the Common Core standards are, unproven, untested. And she became angry at that point. She said that wasn't true. She said teachers were involved in developing the Common Core, at which point I argued that no, they were not. I knew who was involved in making the Common Core. So we had a few back and forths. And she ended our exchange by pointing her finger at me and saying, you can stay where you are, but the train has left the station. These things are happening. So, while this is a common refrain we hear from a lot of reformers, it represents a false choice. Get on the train or stand still. These are our only 2 choices, according to people like Nancy Zimpher. It is also a troubling representation of the work that we do in schools, of who we are, and who determines the nature of the work that we do, and as well as the underlying purposes of the work that we do, right? We have the train, not train, stay on or get off. So in defending the Common Core, whose complicated relationships with business groups and political leaders is shown in this graphic, right? The Common Core was not created by a group of teachers, and it was not demanded by teachers. The Chancellor repeated a typical phrase that's used by supporters of contemporary corporate education reform. The train has left the station. What she means is resistance is futile, get on or be left behind. And that would be left behind. Happy to be left behind. So I tell my students who are teacher candidates that the role of educators is to prepare students to live in, better yet to construct a world that does not yet exist. That means we can't predict exactly what assessment should look like or what standards should look like. We can have an idea, we can have a map, but we can't exactly predict because we don't know what the future is going to look like. So the metaphor of the train with standardized schedules and pre-existing tracks is contradictory to this essential idea. So even though the expression is cliched, I would like to extend the metaphor and think about what questions emerge about the train. So who built it and why? Where is it going? Why is it going so fast? What's the hurry? Who's on board and who is left behind? And with respect to that, I'll repeat a line that I use frequently, which is, if these standards and reforms are so good, why aren't elite private institutions jumping on board? Right? Interesting question. I didn't think to ask Nancy, my friend Nancy, that. So who decides who's on board and who's left behind and who decides? That is, do the passengers choose to be there? Are there no other modes of transportation? And do no other possibilities exist for imagining how education might be different or better? Is it the train or not the train? Or those are only 2 options. Well, I'm going to begin by talking a little bit about the principles of neoliberalism. Can you raise your hand if you've heard of neoliberalism? It's okay if you haven't. Hi. So the story of neoliberalism, I'll try to make it a story to make it sound a little bit less esoteric, theoretical. It's not a new story. It's more like one of Grimm's fairy tales, ancient, resonant, and scary. My friend Eve and colleague Eve Tuck argues that neoliberalism is really a continuation of settler colonialism. If you've heard of that, you have an idea. What it is an extension and an intensification of the colonization of land, wealth, culture, and power. And Henry Giroux notes that under the logic of neoliberalism, the social collapses into the private, part-time labor replaces full-time work, trade unions are weakened, everybody becomes a customer, and the exchange of money takes precedence over social justice, socially responsible citizens, and the building of democratic communities. Does that sound familiar in terms of what's happening in our world today? You've seen these kinds of things, full-time labor changing into part-time work, temporary labor, replacing full-time jobs that have benefits and that you can live on. So although these principles and policies interrelate and do not only affect education, they affect every field in our culture and in our world today, I have some examples of how these principles, the 6 of them up there, relate to the field of education. So the rule of the market plays out with the rhetoric of school choice. Charters in Buffalo right now, right? The whole idea of parental choice, which is really a false choice because the choices are so limited. It's kind of like get on the train or don't get on the train. So school choice and the rule of the market turns all citizens into consumers. That's how that principle plays out in the field of education. Even in higher education, President Obama refers to his new college rating system as a shopping sheet or a scorecard. Right? These are principles that are kind of antithetical to education for social justice and community collaboration. The second principle, cutting public expenditures, you're at a public institution, I'm sure you're familiar with that. You understand how these kinds of things are working. In public institutions, we have first-hand experience with it. When public resources are diminished, the rich get richer. That's what happens. It also results in deprofessionalization, that is lower wages, fewer benefits, which belies President Obama's claim about corporate interests, because his claim is that neoliberalism, he doesn't call it that, but that's what it is good because corporations want educated consumers. So that's why we're doing this work, in case you were wondering, according to our president. So the third claim, deregulation of private and increased regulation of public. Sounds a little bit complicated, but the clearest example I can think of right now involves Teach for America and EdTPA. EdTPA represents increased regulation of teacher preparation programs. Is anyone not familiar with EdTPA? So I can say a little bit or a lot about it. You're all sorry. So you all know what it is. So EdTPA represents increased regulation, clearly implemented by outside sources and outside scorers. Increased regulation for institutions like this one, full teacher preparation programs. However, Teach for America is a primarily privately funded 5 to 8 week preparation program that places students in primarily urban schools, really untrained students in primarily urban schools. Anyone never heard of Teach for America? Okay. So Teach for America candidates don't have to take EdTPA until 2 years after they've been teaching. So if you go through a full program like this one, right, where you've had education courses, not 8 weeks or 5 weeks of a boot camp, before you can enter a classroom with a full-time job, you need to pass EdTPA and pay the $300. If you go through Teach for America, you can take a 5-week summer course, enter a classroom, teach for 2 years, then complete your EdTPA. Decreased regulation of the private, increased regulation of the public. Right? Bad. Neoliberalism, bad. So the third one is privatization. It involves using public funds for private profit. You can see how these things are interrelated for sure. Entrepreneurs like the idea of using tax dollars to support their investments. Schools are guaranteed income to private investors because our tax dollars support them. Recently, the U.S. Department of Education awarded $330 million to support 2 independent test development companies, Park and I forgot the name of the other one, Smarter Balance or Smarter something. So those are tax funds that are being used to support private entities. All of these groups are connected with that. Pearson is positioned to earn massive profits from EdTPA. You pay $300 to take it, scorers are paid about $75. Right there, massive profits. Everyone in New York State has to take it. As an example of an education management organization, Ron Packard of K-12 Inc., which is an online charter school. You see a big sign for it in the Buffalo airport when you get up. Online K-12 charter school. He made $19 million between 2009 and 2013, even though only 28% of his students met the standards of the states in which the schools operate. So we have 2 sets of standards, private and public. And Bill Gates spent so far approximately $173.5 million just to support the Common Core standards. He's not doing that because his heart's in the right place. Maybe it is, but he's doing it because it represents tremendous opportunity for profit. And last spring, I learned that Verizon, Apple, AT&T, Microsoft, and Sprint have partnered to invest more than $750 million worth of products and internet services to support schools, primarily technology to support schools. So, whoops, did I go ahead? I'm still on this one. So the point is that neoliberal principles seek to replace the public good and community with the belief in individual responsibility. From this perspective, humans and institutions exist in competition with each other. In education, this competition is evident in a lot of places. Our reliance on false positivism to rank students, teachers, and institutions on the basis of standardized criteria. That's one example of the competition. They're ranking schools of education on several criteria, one of which is how you do on a TPA. Another one is whether or not you can get a full-time job. And then, down the road, it's how your future students do on their future standardized assessments. That's going to come back and rank how we did to prepare you, despite the fact that we know that a lot of times students' performance on standardized tests is not entirely related to the quality of the teacher or the teacher preparation program. Okay, so that's neoliberalism in a nutshell. So for neoliberals, education represents a multi-trillion-dollar, with a T, economic opportunity for corporate profit. This is not what education represents for me, and probably not what it represents for you. Most of you did not get an education to get rich. And if you did, it's probably a mistake. Public entities like schools are coerced into complying with expensive mandates that gut our budgets, making them less able to succeed, right? So we have mandates that make us less able to do the work that we think we should do. Then they look at the results that we get on the basis of reduced resources and decide that we're failing. So then they reduce our resources more and create private entities to compete with us, private entities that are very well funded. So that's how the cycle works. That's in part how you get the rhetoric around failing schools that is generated to a great extent by media conglomerations that are also corporate and stand to benefit from some of these things. So, a recent example of how this cycle works existed last spring when Commissioner King predicted, I don't know if you remember this, but Commissioner of Education John King predicted that there would be a 30% failure rate on the new Common Core related assessments. Lo and behold, when the assessments were released, the results, there was a 30% failure rate. Interesting, how does such a thing happen? How does such a thing happen? Well, I can give you an example that happened when the new algebra exams came out. Probably about 5 years ago, the brand new 9th grade algebra exams came out. And all of the students took the assessments, and then all the teachers sent the results back to the state, at which time the state decided what the cut points would be. So that, to me, is cheating. They can accuse us of cheating, but that when they look at the results and determine where the passing point's going to be, that's not a valid means of assessment. And that's how John King was able to predict that 30% would fail, because they got the results to determine where the failure rate would be, and then lo and behold, 30% failed. So the words of 2 members of Diane Ravitch, who Diane Ravitch refers to as the Billionaires Boys Club, are revealing. And these are Bill Gates. He said in 2009, when the tests are aligned to the common standards, the curriculum will line up as well. And that will unleash powerful market forces in the service of better teaching. My sense is the emphasis of that is the powerful market forces, not the service of better teaching. And customers and products, that's what this is about. And then Rupert Murdoch in 2010, when it comes to K-12 education, we see a $500 billion sector in the US. So we're a sector. That's why they're interested in us. And just to give you a sense of the infiltration, this is our state education letterhead. I did not Photoshop that. Crazy, in my opinion. So part of the challenge of responding to neoliberalism, because that's what Vanessa wants me to try to do, is that myths are the stories that we use to explain our reality. Lies are tough to refute, but myths are much more insidious and harder to contest. And much of my work as a scholar and a teacher involves listening to and seeking to understand narratives. That's the kind of work that I try to do in my research, such as the one presented, perhaps unwittingly, by the Chancellor. How does the metaphor of the train symbolize and influence contemporary education reform initiatives? What stories does it tell about us and about the work that we do? So as with many myths that are created and perpetuated by those in power, not those like us who are doing the work, there are often tremendous contradictions about the reality of the work that we do and the stories that are told about our work. As part of this talk, what I'm going to do is explore some myths, share some stories, and reveal how our work is being colonized by the myths of neoliberalism, and talk about why that matters. And these are some of the myths about the work that we do. Right? We know this. You're experiencing this and seeing it. It's ironic that reformers demand data-driven and research-based approaches, but they ignore the abundance of research that indicates that competition and standardization are bad for learning. The neoliberal story is that the path to a better world is paved with profit. Life exists to serve the market, land exists to serve the market, learning exists to serve the market. These limited perspectives on the purposes of life and land and learning have detrimental effects on social relations, on human development. And if they're allowed to persist, they will eventually result in the destruction of the public good. I really believe that. I think that's part of the reason we need to fight it. Valuing profit over people underlies the myths that are undermining education. So much of my scholarship attempts to honor the lived experiences of people as they shape and are shaped by their cultural context. I think that words matter and stories matter because stories are how we create meanings about ourselves, each other, and the world. So in short, I believe in the power of stories and that it is critical to attend to the stories that are told about us and the stories we tell about others, not to mention the stories we tell about ourselves. So I'm going to be talking today about 3 research studies and the stories that they told me. The first one I call Inscribing Class, Resistance Literacy. It was a research project that I did in a predominantly white working class high school. The research questions for the project were these. How did teachers and students in a predominantly white working class first-ring suburban high school experience and articulate academic practices to writing? What factors influence these practices? And how do these practices relate to social class and empowerment or disempowerment? And to answer these questions, I use critical ethnography because it does deal with the lived experiences of students and teachers through qualitative methods. I was in the school for 1 full year. I interviewed 21 teachers across all content areas, both men and women of varied experiences. I interviewed 20 11th grade students, 10 females and 10 males, who represented the range of academic achievement based on their grades. And then I analyzed tons and tons of documents, anything I could get my hands on in terms of teachers' assignments, letters that went home to parents, all kinds of things like that. And I also observed classes of the teachers whom I interviewed. And for this presentation, I've distilled my findings into these 3 categories. High-stakes assessments related to writing result in narrow curriculum, deprofessionalization of teachers, and disempowering writing instruction. So in terms of narrow curriculum, the teachers and students at what I call Pontiac High School consistently made connections between high-stakes testing and narrowing of curriculum. When I asked June Summers whether New York State exams had affected her curriculum, she said, "I think so. I think it drives our curriculum. Obviously, our test results are very important, and we're measured by those results, unfortunately, and our student success is measured by those results. So you end up teaching to the exam." Social studies teacher Gary Ventura echoed this perspective. He said, "In the society we live in, especially in New York State, where Regents exams drive all, state assessments drive curriculum, they drive instruction." High-stakes tests reinforce redefinitions of knowledge that are empirical and not constructivist. And furthermore, since scores are based on individual work, it reinforces competition and individualism, not the social organic nature of teaching and learning and language. Furthermore, standardized assessments reduce professionalism. These were really interesting because it showed how teachers have lost their decision-making power because of the standardized assessments that are implemented. They think that it's unfair that their professional fate is closely tied to student performance. Gary Ventura says, I think there's just so much stress. You have to show adequate yearly progress and all these things that have been set forth by the government. There's so much pressure on these tests that that's what the teachers are striving for. If this kid doesn't get a 65, then they're thinking, does this measure teacher accountability? If the kids don't perform, then the teacher is done. Roger Johnson describes feeling powerless to resist pressure to provide what he knows to be substandard writing instruction in the service of state assessments. And he says, in the junior year, you're teaching the regents. And I have mixed feelings about that. Because on one hand, it's an important test in terms of my bosses, the principal, the superintendent. I know we need to have certain scores. That's the dilemma, I guess. Are we adding to the problem? Part of me is practical. I like my job. It's hard. But if my boss is giving me an ultimatum, I guess I'm going to abide by it. I'm realistic, and I'm not going to fight battles I know I can't win. Interestingly, even students narrated awareness of teacher subordination to state initiatives. When I asked about teachers' expectations for writing, Samuel said, when it comes to English, they're strict, very ridiculously strict, but you got to do it. And when it comes to teachers, they're just doing their job. If it comes to writing, they just give you an assignment because New York State says they have to. I mean, it all goes back to New York State. And Chloe's response was similar. The teachers just basically show us how to write the Regents because that's what I've been told by our teachers. Well, I'm here to teach you how to write for the Regents because you have to pass it in order to graduate. You can't write what you want to write because it's not what they want. We have to write for the Regents. If you don't do it, you can't graduate. You can't get into college. The state defines literacy practices through examinations. The examinations foster a culture of compliance. Resistance is perceived as hazardous and futile. Get on the train or get off. Narrations of students and teachers indicate a perspective of writing instruction that is consistent with the banking or transmission view of teaching and learning. Gary Ventura said, you gotta think of a kid almost like a blank slate. To use the Lockean term tabula rasa, a kid comes to you as a blank slate. Stan Ryan, who was head of the English department, repeats this theme of students as empty vessels. He says, I used to talk about filling buckets, okay? Students come to me and have buckets that need to be filled. This is an empty bucket, and fill it. It's that stuff in, stuff out idea. Knowledge is viewed as external, not something that's constructed by students. Sorry. It's okay. So I asked Sean Thomas to describe his writing instruction, and he said, in social studies, with a thematic essay and document-based questions, it's totally content-driven. Are we fulfilling the purpose of students being good writers? No. We just want them to spew facts back at us. Dylan, an 11th grade boy, emphasizes the effect of state assessments on writing. I had students, as part of the interview process, bring an example of typical school writing and a piece of writing that meant something to them. And Dylan was describing his typical piece of school writing. He said, it's on Macbeth. We had this Regents exam we had a couple of weeks ago. Again, there's 4 types of essays you can write. And what the teacher did was, all year until the Regents, he just made us write the same essay over and over again because it's this exact formula, and this exact essay is what you'll get 100 times. And Dylan just repeated this verbatim. He wasn't looking at his paper. He said, the teacher would write the notes with blanks. Quote, the literary element blank can be used to prove that blank, and the author blank used his blank to prove blank. This is seen in the scene where the character blanked. He gave us this exact formula for this essay. I got probably 20 essays in my binder that are pretty much the same as this. Shocking. So I asked him about his teacher's expectations for students writing, and Dylan said, it's mostly just follow the format, agree with everything, agree with all the quotes, and a lot of repetitive stuff like that. They tell you what to write, and you copy it down exactly. And this line is chilling to me. The only difference between your essay and the guy next to you is the name on top of the essay. Not my definition of writing. So I did this presentation in Rockport. And one of the people in the, one of the teacher educators in the group said, so what? So what if working class kids get this kind of writing instruction? And this is why this matters. Because writing and thinking are connected. And because we live in a democracy. And if everyone doesn't get an equal opportunity to develop their literacy skills, their literacy fully, then they can't be full participants in our democracy. Of course it matters. I think he was just playing rhetorical game with me, but still. Apparently I'm still a little defensive about it. So since this study was completed, the use of software to assess students' writing has made the issue even more predominant. So things were always getting better. So we know that high-stakes standardized assessments are commodifying, alienating, and exploitive of teacher and student labor. If you think of the fact that teachers and students use the hours of the class time to generate data that's going to go to the state/Pearson to generate information, you could argue that that is exploitive of the labor of teachers and students. And I would argue that. Who is benefiting from this? It's not the students, it's not the teachers, it's not the community. People are making profit from these assessments. In this school, writing was seen as a means of control, not a means of developing thought. Resistance results in failure. What can they do? If they refuse to do the assignment, they get a 0. If they do the assignment differently, they get a 0. It's like me in the train again. So within this working class school, what was happening was students were learning that words are weapons that can be used against them, not arms with which they might choose to fight for their own rights, which is, to me, a reversal of how it should be. So we know that generally speaking, resistance inhibits achievement, but I don't want to leave you with just like, things are horrible in this place. At the time I was working in the school when I did the study, and I was able to work with teachers to implement some things that are much more positive, and I have examples of that in my book, or I'd be happy to share them with you if you wanted to email me later. So there is kind of a happier ending, but I thought, just wanted to share that with you. The next story I'm going to share with you is entitled Practicing in the Panopticon, Teaching and Learning in the Surveillance Media Culture. It was co-conducted with David and my colleague Katie Lalonde at Dewville High School. And if you're not familiar with the Panopticon, it's a type of institutional building developed in the late 18th century. And the concept of the design, oops, did that not pop up? The concept of the design, there's two images of it, is to allow a single watchman to observe all the inmates of an institution without them being able to tell whether they are being watched or not, right? So although it's physically impossible for a single watchman to observe all the cells at once, you never know whether or not you're going to be being observed. So ideally what happens in a situation like this is you begin to monitor and control and regulate your own behavior. That's the beauty of the Panopticon. So if we think we're being watched, we control our own behavior and internalize the norms, the external norms. Foucault notes that Panopticon is not just a building, it's an exercise of power, an architecture of power. An example of this occurring in schools today involves the black boxes that are in some of the school buses. When I was working at a local school district, they had some problems with discipline on the bus, or maybe they just anticipated them. So they put black boxes in all of the buses, but not all of them had cameras because that would have been too expensive. So you never knew whether there was a live camera in the box in the back of the bus or not, which is kind of a panopticon. You just assume you're being watched. And of course today we probably safely can assume that we're always being watched. So a research question, not a lot of jobs can you get paid to watch reality TV. So this is one of those kinds of studies. How is the concept of professionalism in the workplace represented in contemporary reality television? And how do representations of professionalism with respect to leadership, learning, and culture relate to the identity development of educators? So to address our research question, we watched 3 reality TV programs. Frontline, the education of Michelle Reed, that's the woman in the middle. She was the chancellor of the DC schools for a while. Teach, Tony Danza, and if you ever have a chance to watch that, don't. It's horrible. Read my chapter instead. I will be glad we will send it to you, but don't watch it. And the third one was Undercover Boss, which was kind of has an interesting connection. Frontline gave us a glimpse of leadership in K-12 schooling. Teach, Tony Danza, an on-the-ground experience depiction of an urban high school. And Undercover Boss gave us a perspective on professionalism beyond the field of education, because everybody watches these shows today, not just teachers. So these are the themes that emerged. The cult of personality, which connects to, in the green there, connects to neoliberalism. The ubiquity and influence of surveillance, you know about that, surveillance relates to data. And the persistence of the myth of meritocracy, which is theoretically the American dream. So Undercover Boss, has anyone ever seen Undercover Boss? Okay, good. Undercover Boss is an international TV series that features senior executives, CEOs, working undercover in their own companies to theoretically investigate how their firms really work. reinforcing the surveillance of the panopticon, and to reward deserving employees, which reinforces the notion of meritocracy. That's the premise of the story. Executives, because they're undercover, they have to change their appearances and assume a fictional backstory, which usually involves them being some kind of terrible failure and trying to make a comeback in this organization, the organization that they're really the CEO of. One of the really interesting parts of this show is the way they put the bosses undercover. So what you see there is what a CEO looks like and what you and I look like their perspective of how we might. And I think these images alone say a lot about how they perceive workers, ordinary people, the kind of common man who ought to be exposed to the common core, right? These are who we are to people like CEOs. I have nothing against tattoos or funky glasses or long hair. It's perfectly fine. But I think it's interesting the way they, the way they change their identities. So the CEOs spend 1 to 2 weeks working in various areas of their company's operations. They do the most menial work you can find, and they inevitably have some sort of amusing failure connected with that. Like, oh look, the CEO can't figure out how to run a cash register, but he's the CEO. So there are these interesting dynamics. At the end of their time undercover, the executives summon certain selected employees who always have heart-wrenching stories of loss and
debt.
They're in debt. They have heart-wrenching stories. They're always working really hard and also taking care of an elderly parent and raising an adopted child and all these amazing, really truly amazing stories. I would never make fun of those people because they do work really hard while at the same time embodying the principles of the organization. Right? They put the organization first, even with all these other responsibilities, and they're about to lose their house and they're riding their bike to work because their car broke down. All these kinds of things. So they summon these employees to a central location, usually corporate headquarters, and they don't know why they're coming, although they have been duped into thinking that this person who can't figure out how to run the cash register is part of a reality TV show about people with second chances. So they've been lied to all along. The employees have been lied to all along. So that's how they get the cameras in to observe these things. So what happens is hardworking employees get rewarded through promotion or financial rewards. If you were not a very good employee, usually you get a second chance, better working conditions, you'll get better training, those kinds of things. But it's really important to consider the multi-layered effects of this program. How the idea of working within a panopticon, where rewards and punishments are continually possible, affects the identity of those watching those being watched. So if I'm watching this program, what am I learning about the job I'm doing? I'm learning that I'm always being watched. And if I do a really good job, even though I'm being paid a pittance, maybe I'll get a reward. Maybe this guy who's coming in here who I'm training is the undercover boss. So I should really try all the time really hard, even though I can't make enough to live on. So I think that is a really important aspect of the show. The other part of the reveal that drove Dave crazy in doing the study, he did the study with me, was how they show the boss sitting behind his desk and the workers coming in clearly a little bit nervous and afraid and not sure what's happening, and the whole thing is really very uncomfortable. So current perspectives of school reform are consistent with the myth of meritocracy. Michelle Reed, when she was in the DC public schools, created a system of winners and losers, all connected to standardized assessments. She fired sets of teachers that their assessment scores were not high enough. And we found out later, of course, that there were big scandals connected with the DC school district, and there was a lot of cheating, and many of those people, and I don't blame the people who cheated, because if you know about Campbell's Law and what happens with assessments and high-stakes assessments and social trends, cheating will always occur when you have a high-stakes assessment connected to someone's job. So the premise of Teach Tony Danza is that the former television personalities, anyone know who Tony Danza is? You do know who he is? Yeah. From what? Who's the boss? Good, okay.
Taxi.
That's right, okay, good, that was a little task. So the former television personality has decided he wants to give back to society by volunteering to become an English teacher in an inner-city Philadelphia high school for 1 year. Danza has an ancient degree in college, but no teaching credential. I think his degree is in English, but not even sure about that. He is at best minimally prepared to teach, and in essence he is learning on the job. What trumps his credential is his celebrity. And this is an ongoing theme, we'll see. The message to viewers and students is that education and expertise are less relevant than funds or fame. Michelle Reed, by the way, was a Teach for America, worked for 2 years teaching, and then became the chancellor. So if you have career plans involving a chancellor, teach for 2 years. I don't know how to make that happen. So this matters because your professional identities are influenced by ideologies perpetuated in the media. It's evident from the beginning of the show, Teach Tony Danza, that he perceives himself not as a teacher trying to give back, but as a personality who's trying to, who sees his former fame as the key to success. In the very first episode, he says, "I'm from Malibu Beach. What am I doing here?" The implication of this, of course, is what is a great, fabulous celebrity like him doing in an ordinary classroom? I thought, though, it was really interesting to think about it from the perspective of the kids. Like, what is he doing here? He doesn't know what he's doing. He's not a teacher. So I would love to be able to turn that question around to him. I mentioned Michelle Rhea already, who was not, didn't have any degrees in education, became a leader through Teach for America, taught for 2 years, and then began firing teachers in the DC area. The undercover bosses, as I mentioned earlier, are shown to be inept at simple tasks, but are clearly skilled at running corporate empires. So the message is ubiquitous and not just on television. The message that celebrity matters more than education. New York State Education Commissioner John King was a teacher for 3 years, after which his wealthy, powerful connections, that would include Nancy Zimpher, appointed him to lead our state schools. U.S. Secretary of Education Arne Duncan, who was no classroom experience. He ran a nonprofit and then he ran the Chicago schools. And so the architect of the Common Core and the president of the College Board, David Coleman, has 0 K-12 teaching experience. And then of course there's Bill Gates. Bill Gates have a teaching credential? No. College degree? No. College dropout. So, yeah, the message of the meritocracy is a twisted one. So as I mentioned before, surveillance and power are interconnected. You'll see the scene from the opening scene from Undercover Boss reinforces the idea that we're always being watched all the time. And I'll just reiterate one more time the Undercover Boss, the reveal reward part of the show. I think what's really interesting is invariably the rewarded employees are reduced to tears by the generous gestures given by the undercover bosses because they are in fact about to lose their houses and they have no car to get to work and they're suffering under mountains of student loans, right? So they're reduced to tears by the generous gestures. They might get, say, $20,000 to put toward their child's college education. This $20,000 is, of course, a pittance in connection to what a CEO of a corporation or the corporation itself earns. It's also important, I think, to note that the rewards typically represent what a good society might consider to be human rights. Worthy employees should be rewarded, should not need a special reward to have funds for childcare, for decent housing, for medical care, and education. These should not be bonuses that are earned by the lucky employees who happen to make friends with the undercover CEO. We should all have access to these things if we're working as part of a good society. It should not be something that only certain people are allowed to connect with. In 2010, Michelle Reed fired 600 teachers based on test scores, and in Frontline, she fires a principal who did not know he was going to be fired on camera, but on camera completely humiliates him and fires him. And Teach Tony Danza is constantly reminded of how precarious his position is. Interestingly, though, he ends up proving his worth to the school by hosting an extravaganza, which is an entertainment program in which he is the star, which earns the school and earns funds to get an air conditioner for the library of the school. So I guess he wasn't completely useless. So Tony Danza has an interesting perspective on education. He thinks that it doesn't really exist. He is, when he has 2 students in his class who are allowed to have accommodations, he decides that they just aren't trying hard enough. And at the same time, he talks about how this is the hardest things he's ever done. So the rules, this to me represents the dichotomy between the rules of the bosses and the rules for the workers, right? They aren't trying hard enough, they should try harder. This is the hardest thing he's done. In addition to taking credit for success while outsourcing blame, the myth of meritocracy requires that social context be ignored. Even though he has no teaching nor counseling experience, Tony Danza is working with a student who needs some tutoring and has had some issues with truancy. And Danza, encourages him to have some self-discipline, the student responds, I had to sit in jail when my mom died. And Dan's response is, whose fault is that? Yeah. I would like to, again, another question I would like to turn back to Tony, if he were interesting. There's no contextual nuance to his issue. It's clear to him who is to blame and who is not. And finally, Kat Cole, who is the CEO of Cinnabon, has several mantras that I think represent a lot of what school reformers say. Are you hungry enough? You have to try harder, make it happen, figure it out. Some people may be left behind. That's perfectly okay in this perspective of school reform. Be sure you really are as hungry as you say you are. So solidarity and community don't matter. If you can't cut it, you're out of here. These ideals ignore the social context, ignore systemic inequities, and perpetuate mythical aspects of reform. On a more positive note, though, well, these are the messages we ended up with. Education is not valued, personality matters, competition is valued over cooperation, constant surveillance reinforces existing power, and the myth of meritocracy is perpetuated. Happily, though, these examples of reality TV are not the only examples out there. Students in my education courses at New Paltz created images that indicate that they do, as part of our classwork, created images that indicate that they do understand the social context. So I just wanted to leave, again, a little bit of hope to the future. You represent our hope for the future. We know that you know better than reality TV. The third, I'm just going to talk very briefly about the third story, and it is Reclaiming the Public, Beat Nation. It's a collective of hip-hop, indigenous hip-hop artists, a study that I did with my colleague, Brad Porfilio, who was in California, University of California, Bay. And all of the images in this part of my talk are from the Beat Nation. So they're hip-hop artists. Skeeter Reese is one of them. So this study was motivated by a commitment to showcase how alternative youth culture has the potential to resist neoliberalism. I don't want to end with the idea that neoliberalism is us and we just need to roll over or get on the train. So a different way of looking at it. Various forms of alternative art, and we argue in our study, at the end of our study, our findings indicate that hip-hop offers ways to reinvent, amplify, and strengthen the voices of indigenous youth within urban Canadian, American, and indigenous communities. Why hip-hop? Well, hip-hop is multifaceted and interactive, just like good educational experiences. It's rooted in resistance and struggle. And neither its roots nor its shoots are reducible to a single culture, nation, or race. That's why we chose to focus on hip-hop. One of the central challenges of this study was that we are both white researchers working with an indigenous collective of hip-hop artists. So we had to really examine our own assumptions, which was a fascinating aspect of the study that I don't really have time to talk deeply about today. But just so you know that it was part of our study, and it was something that we reflected on and wrote about and connected with others with more expertise in the area. So we looked at indigenous methods. We looked at the idea of embracing the struggle, not looking at education as a problem to be solved or a series of problems to be solved, but as a struggle to be embraced. And we looked at the importance of listening, learning, and sharing. One of our participants, Rose Simpson, in our interview, it said, expression is a boil over a soul, a reflection to learn from. I find my way with expressive sonar. I beep, it bounces and returns to me. I am pursuing truth. When I finish a piece, I let it tell me a story, then pick up some more play. That to me really speaks to us as English educators, as language as art. So the emerging themes from this study were the importance of public intervention and the importance of dialogicality, which means that we are listening and talking, and we're both meaningful participants in the construction of knowledge. Hip-hop can raise awareness and consciousness, and it's inherently nonconformist art that connects to youth culture. So hip-hop fosters the possibility for both of these things to happen. As public intervention, the artists use graffiti and various kinds of traditional and performance art to interrupt dominant performances or representations of power. Kinney Starr says, to a woman who carries native blood but is mostly white by blood quantum, hip-hop is a world where storytelling allows me to be frank about my questions, my spirit, and my life mission, which is that people should come together. When I asked her to describe her role as an educator and hip-hop artist in society, she says, I would say I'm a shit disturber. I like to turn over rocks. Kinney Starr emphasizes the importance of true dialogue with youth. A far cry from the notion of youth as empty vessels or empty buckets, right? She says, there is no room for pointing fingers. We are on a crucial collapse as a planet, and there's no room for pointing fingers at each other. There's only room for listening. One of the questions we asked the participants was what messages we would like to give political youth today, political leaders today. And Rose Simpson said, you are mistreating your youth. Your youth are your most precious, precious thing, and you're not listening. You're not seeing them, you're not respecting them, you're not giving them the love that they need. It's generational abuse, it's passed down. If you're not told how to love yourself by being shown how love works, then you have no love for yourself and you don't know how to give it to somebody else. Another question we asked was what advice we might give to a younger brother or sister. And Rose Simpson said, I wouldn't give them any advice. I would say, I love you, and I support you. We have a lot to learn from them. So, neoliberalism in education. What does neoliberalism do? It codifies and normalizes dominant cultural values, uses surveillance and other technologies to ensure compliance. It degrades youth relationships and humanity, and it creates competition for diminishing resources, which results in increasing concentration of wealth and power and decreasing commitment to public institutions. And I've said this before, and some of you saw this image last night. I love it. If these reforms are so good, then why aren't their children being subjected to their effects? Genuine question, real question. Ask it everywhere you go. So as resources diminish, schools and teachers are upholding their charge to nurture students and foster pedagogies that serve the needs of future generations. How do we do this? It's simple and it's hard. We value youth. We attend to the context in which we work. We listen to stories, and then we share stories. We amplify the stories of the people who know best. And that's us. And I promised you some truths. And I think these are extremely safe truths. And I'm going to ask this row to read them out loud because I'm so tired of my voice. So will you read the first one, and we'll just go right down the row.
Education is a human right.
Teacher education is an essential component of public education.
Education is human, social, and recursive, cultural, and complex.
Education is not technical, compartmentalized, or easily defined.
Right, don't ever do this with your secondary students, by the way, so thank you for pointing it out to me. Good. Next one?
We can transform through continuous improvement guided by culturally sustaining critical pedagogies.
Thank you.
We may not always see the path, but we have the tools to build it, working and learning alongside our students.
Thank you. So the truths about the train? We know the truths about the train, right? It conceals more than it reveals. Education ought to be an awakening of what we know, another Moffat quote, a construction of identity that includes awareness of our continuous state of becoming. And I just love to end with this quote. I've never encountered any children, I can't read this because it makes me cry every time, so who will read it for me?
I have never encountered any children in any group who are not geniuses. There is no mystery on how to teach them. First thing you do is treat them like human beings, and the second thing you do is love them. EESA Dr.
Thank you.